Hey everybody, Paul Warburg here in Utah, and today I wanted to talk about something that we probably don't think about enough, which is the United States' dependence on Mexico for military production capabilities, especially if the US ever found itself in a major global conflict where they needed high-capacity production for advanced weapons systems. Now, a lot of people don't even realize that this dependence exists, and to be clear, the dependence is not on high-tech military technology, but rather the dependence is on more basic things like steel and car bodies that America has lost a lot of the capability that it once had in its pursuit of economic prosperity. Now, the backdrop to this conversation is the war in Ukraine, where a major factor on the battlefield has to do with the ability for each side to produce enough weapons. If you're familiar with World War II, you know that this war largely contributed to the United States getting pulled out of the Great Depression. Because when the war occurred, there was such a need for production that everybody without a job pretty much instantly had one. Now, this happened because at the time, the United States was a global leader in manufacturing and in high-tech manufacturing. We produced a lot of our own vehicles. We produced the steel for a lot of our own vehicles. And that meant that when a war hit, we were able to ramp up those industries very quickly, get America to work, and get our military the equipment that they needed. And a lot of people just assume that because we did that in World War II, we would be able to do that again today. But unfortunately, that might not actually be true. A couple things happened after World War II that really changed America as a nation, and especially the American manufacturing industry. And the first thing that happened was actually a good thing for American manufacturing, which was that during World War II, most of the other developed manufacturing infrastructure in Europe was completely destroyed. It was obviously a main target for bombing raids and war efforts. And that meant that as Europe reconstructed, America was left as the dominant economy that could still manufacture and produce things. This is one of the reasons for the massive prosperity of the boomer generation. It's one of the reasons that our current generation is not nearly as well off as our grandparents were, because they existed in a world that, for all intents and purposes, had very little manufacturing competition. But of course, all of that made America very prosperous. And as America got more prosperous, they started to move into different types of industries. And as other nations recovered, America started trying to ship manufacturing overseas to whoever the lowest bidder was. For a time, this shipping of manufacturing overseas, while it did impact a lot of people in America negatively, it was actually an overall benefit to our society and our economy, as we got a lot of goods that we could spend all our money on, and we got them really cheap. But the problem is that we forgot about World War II. We forgot about how important and necessary it was to have our own production capability, and we became dependent on other nations that have now largely become our largest geopolitical opponents. The biggest nation we became dependent on was obviously China. There's also other nations, though, nations like India and Vietnam, where a large portion of their economies is dependent on doing manufacturing for the United States. Now, as geopolitical tensions in these parts of the world have escalated, the United States has over time seen that we need to diversify our manufacturing. And so a lot of our manufacturing was moved right across our border, where we could still get cheap labor, and I hate to say it that way, but that's the way we look at it, where we could still get cheap labor without the geopolitical risks that come with having to ship things overseas. We're talking about basic things like steel, finished copper, a lot of capabilities that used to be done in the US and no longer are. Because of all of these factors, if a major world war were ever to break out again, or even just a major war between the US and China or Russia, say if Russia escalated its invasions in Europe, or if China escalated their plans to invade Taiwan, the US would actually be in a position where we are dependent on Mexico to produce weapons and arms at a high velocity. Unfortunately, it seems that Russia and China are more aware of this fact than the United States is. And Russia and China are working on cozying up to Mexico to conceivably, hopefully, get things to be more in their favor if this situation were ever to occur. If you remember in World War I, what ended up dragging the United States into the conflict was the Zimmermann Telegraph, where Germany sent their Mexican ambassador a message basically encouraging Mexico to invade the United States. And that, of course, upset the US and put us at war with Germany. The rest of the world is not ignorant of our geopolitical positioning, so we need to not be ignorant of it either. So the point of this is not to poke at either side of the obviously tense political conversations that occur in the United States and have been occurring for the past several decades about Mexico. It's just to remind us to be aware of our vulnerability and our need to have good relationships with our neighbors, however those good relationships play out. We are not alone in this world. We have chosen to set our nation up in a geopolitical environment that is dependent on other nations, even small nations, and it would be wise of us to not forget that fact. That's all for today. See you guys on the next one.